It's 7 p.m. on D-Day.
And the Germans are counterattacking. Well, okay, they have been for a while, actually. The German armor, that which is available, has had a heck of an odyssey all day long before it could get into position and attack. But I digress. Here's today's twisted tale of the 21st Panzers.
Where are the tanks? Where are the Engländer? Wondered Private Hammes. He and 3 other German soldiers barely slowed their motorcycles as they weaved through the turns and light traffic on the road to where they had been told the Allies had finally launched the D-Day invasion of Adolf Hitler's Festung Europa. Not far behind them stretched a long stream of half-tracks carrying 192nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment's 1st Battalion, a company of sappers from 220th Panzer Engineer Battalion, and a battery of self-propelled anti-tank guns. All belonged to the 21st Panzer Division, which had reformed around a cadre of 2,000 veterans of the battles of North Africa. The 21st Panzers were actually destroyed in Tunisia in May 1943 and were reformed in July in Rennes under the 7th Army. In personnel, it's a bit of a mix. Veterans who'd escaped Tunisia, Eastern Front veterans, the 931st Mobile Brigade, miscellaneous panzer companies. Panzergeneral Leo von Schweppenberg will say this of the division. The division was reorganized with undesirable personnel from a large number of divisions. Even very thorough and experienced training could never overcome this basic fault. What it actually consists of are the 192nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment, the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, and the 100th Panzer Regiment. But each of these only has 2 battalions and not 3 like normal. They do also have 3 battalions of the 155th Panzer Artillery Regiment, the 220th Panzer Engineer Battalion, and the 305th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. I should point out that much of their equipment is obsolete, and of the 10 Panzer or Panzer Grenadier divisions in the West, this is the only one rated unfit for service on the Eastern Front. It spent some time this spring in Hungary, and then when they came back to France in late April, it was split up in several assembly areas on both sides of the Orne and with the artillery at the coast. Feutinger, as we've seen, is the division commander, and Hans von Luck and Josef Rauch command the Grenadier regiments. But back to Private Hammes and his comrades of the 192nd Grenadiers. They really are wondering where the Mark IV Panzers are. Those are pretty slow, and they should have passed Kampfgruppe Oppel by now, but they haven't. And soon enough, Hammes' little group actually reaches the coast between Juno and Sword beaches west of Lyon-sur-Mer. And there they see the awesome spectacle of the gigantic Allied fleet and all of the many dozens of landing craft going back and forth to the beaches and dumping men and machines. Beautiful, just like a parade, said Private Hammes to Private Schad. And at that, the Grenadiers laid back in the tall grass to watch the show, smoke some Turkish cigarettes, and wait for someone to tell them what to do. But thanks to the Allies jamming the German radio frequencies, the men would receive no orders at all until their division commander made his way to the coast nearly 2 hours later with a small detachment of tanks to personally organize an assault. Now, we've talked several times about the convoluted German command structure and the confusing and cumbersome process for getting armor released. But the only armor really available early on today that could have hit the invasion forces while they were still coming in from the water is roughly the Panzers of 21st Division. They were in their staging area just south of Caen this morning. They were ready to move out already at 2 a.m. They spent a few hours early on just waiting around for orders before the ones came to drive the British off the Orne River and Caen Canal bridges and out of Bénouville. We saw just how few the Allies had there by dawn, and while they managed to hold the local German forces, it's kind of a stretch to imagine that they could fight off an entire panzer division. Well, the 21st got their marching orders eventually, and soon were gathering east of the Orne River and readying to head up to take out the paratroopers. It was Hans von Luck's 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment that had started to clash with elements of the 6th Airborne Division during the morning of D-Day. They were stationed on the eastern side of the Orne River and knew the terrain well. Luck's units were committed piecemeal as they arrived, enabling the airborne troops to fight them off, though with dwindling numbers and ammunition. Now, we saw that the British commandos with a company of tanks arrived at the bridges at 1 p.m. By this time, the bulk of 21st Panzer have been in contact with 711th and 716th Infantry attacking near the bridges and have been concentrating behind Luke's men, sort of wasting time securing the eastern bank of the Orne. But they do by then have a good-sized force in place and are massing for the 15-minute drive up the east side of the river. But then they get orders to not hit the bridges and to attack the British beachheads on the other side of the river canal system instead. Thing is, the change in targets was made at 10:30 a.m., but the 21st Panzer Division does not get the order until noon. So they spend the next hour making a new plan. But this causes a bunch of chaos as the Panzers are ordered to go back towards Caen and then around towards Sword Beach instead of just ramming through the enemy at the bridges, which could be the quickest and most direct route to the beach and would take out 2 birds with 1 stone. Hans von Luck is far from happy with this. The regrouping of the division took hours. Most of the units from the east side of Caen and the Orne had to squeeze through the eye of a needle at Caen and over the only bridges available in this sector while under virtual constant bombardment from the Allied Navy and fighter bombers. In fact, the delay in regrouping, going back to Caen, going through the rubble of Caen, and getting set west of the river takes 3.5 hours. Then, Commander Feuchtinger splits up the division, leaving Luck's regiment behind to assault the bridges as originally planned, by which time the defenders of the bridges can call in naval gunfire from the high guns offshore. The Panzer Grenadiers will not take either of the bridges today, and even if they had, they wouldn't have the backup to exploit such a victory. So, the assault towards the beaches finally gets going around 4:30 p.m., by which time General Max has arrived at Caen and tells his armormen, if we don't throw the British back in the sea, we shall have lost the war. They head out, and then they turn into the British armor of the Staffordshire Yeomanry north of Caen. They lose some machines right there and some more to attacks from the air, but disengage and head up towards Perrier Ridge, right? If they keep heading that same direction, they'll reach the coast between Juno and Sword, but here they run into a bunch of Sherman M4 Firefly tanks. Now, Yeomanry Commander Jim Eadie planned well before today to have just these machines at just this ridge before this time. They will form up their squadrons, give out their orders, then drive straight for their objective. What they do not know is that I have 3 troops of Fireflies, which I will station on the ridge and leave as a backstop. See, he anticipated that this would be a route for enemy armor to counterattack through, and these Fireflies are equipped with 17-pounder high-velocity cannons and not the smaller 75mm guns that normal Shermans have. These Shermans are medium tanks based on the American Sherman M4, but have this new long-barreled powerhouse of a cannon, which can penetrate Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, and absolutely the Mark IV Panzers, which they meet today. The Firefly tank is an ordinary Sherman, but in order to accommodate the immense breech of the 17-pounder and store its massive shells, the co-driver has been eliminated and his little den has been used as storage space. The flash is so brilliant that both gunner and commander need to blink at the moment of firing, otherwise they will be blinded for so long they will not see the shot hit the target. The muzzle flash spurts out so much flame that after a shot or two, the hedge or undergrowth in front of the tank is likely to start burning. 6 Panzers are knocked out straight off the bat, and a German flanking movement around to the left cost them 3 more. This is within a matter of minutes. The British have taken 0 tanks knocked out. The fight continues, but it is to the Germans' disadvantage. After the long drive and bright daylight against Allied air power and then the Shermans, they only have 40 or so tanks left as the evening draws on. And it is debatable whether any German tanks actually do manage to reach the coast. Now, Private Hammer's Panzer Grenadier Battalion at the coast between Juno and Sword does get their orders finally to support the the Germans holding out at Lyon-sur-Mer, which they do around 7 p.m. And Feuchtinger wants to send his 40 tanks around the ridge here to support them, and then they'll be in position for tomorrow too. But at 9 p.m., when it's getting dark, Operation Mallard goes off, and hundreds of gliders, transports, and fighters thunder past overhead, and the men of the 21st Panzer Division fear that they're in imminent danger of being cut off, and Feuchtinger issues orders for the division to withdraw from the gap. It might be tempting to see this botched offensive as a failed attempt by the Germans to exploit the gap between the Canadian 3rd Infantry and the British 3rd Infantry Divisions at Juno and Sword. But in reality, it might very well be a failed opportunity by the Allies to destroy much of Rommel's armor when they withdraw. Now, think about it. From the afternoon, naval guns, fighters, anti-tank guns, and Sherman Fireflies have taken out 54 of 120 or so vehicles of the 21st Panzer Division. So that leaves 70 or so machines that, if they don't pull back, could maybe be in the gap in the morning, ready to assault Sword, right? And by then, the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend Regiment will have arrived and be a mobile battle group facing Juno, right? So that would be trouble for the Allies and could roll up Sword and Juno beaches, right? I don't think so. Say, 21st Panzer Division doesn't have much open in way of tactical options. They can try to go around the ridge to the left, but trying that this evening costs another 9 machines. So other than that, they'd have to hit north of the ridge and through Hermanville, since the British have a strong anti-tank screen on the Caen Road and near Lyon-sur-Mer. The British also have the 190 or so tanks of the 27th Armor Brigade landed and ready for a fight, and since their main defensive effort would be keeping the Germans away from the beaches, the Germans would very much be compressed in like a 5-kilometer area between Juno and Sword on open ground in easy range of, what is there offshore? 120 destroyer 4-inch guns, 100 cruiser and battleship guns of 6 inches up to massive 16 inches? This is a recipe for total annihilation. That the German forces massed near Lyon-sur-Mer face total destruction if they stay put has escaped attention. Instead, one finds comments that the 192nd Panzer Grenadiers were lucky to reach the coast. Virtually no attention is paid to the fact that concentrations of naval firepower vastly smaller than that of bombardment groups D and E had shredded German counterattacks in Mediterranean theater operations. This has been the heaviest counterattack of the day, but it has also been a costly failure for the Germans and another lesson in how rotten their command structure has become. But they also had a lot of issues with the terrain. That has a big effect everywhere today. In Cotentin, on and near the beaches, at the bridges, to the east of them, the local topography plays a big part.
Let's have Paul Woodage tell us all about it. You know, local geography and topography have played a huge role in all sorts of military campaigns over the years. We've seen mountains, we've seen deserts, we've seen mighty rivers, we've seen dense jungle vegetation, none of which we see right here. So, Paul, does the local topography play any part here?
Absolutely, because there's a gap that is not seen on most of the maps of D-Day. Most of the maps are June 6th, so Juno Beach and Sword Beach as if they almost butt up right beside each other. Yeah. There's a gap of 2 miles. Sword Beach is there, Juno Beach is there, and amongst what is essentially an urban environment of villages and towns and roads, there's this swathe of fields that goes back south, and back south to somewhere that was important because back there is 21st Panzer.
That is, in my viewpoint, one of the most underestimated events. You just saw that event in the episode, how that all happened and played out. And it has enormous effects. Why are we missing this event in most narratives of D-Day?
I don't know is a simple answer, but to me it is so important because it steers the Allies to have to think about continuing the aggression to being defensive. Because what happened here is these elements of 21st Panzer that had been delayed all day for various reasons of command and control and decision making and what to do, and Hitler and the usual things there.
And Hitler, I like
and Hitler. And they do finally make this break through what they've established is there's 2 beachheads that they can see ahead of them. We label them as Sword and Juno. They don't know that, but they see, hang on, there's a gap between these two things. Both beachheads have progressed inland. Sword, the British are stuck at Hillman. The Canadians are stuck getting towards Douve de l'Ivron, the radar station. But there's a gap, and they're thinking, if we can get up in that gap now and turn left or right or both and hit those rear elements of those advances, we can make a big difference there. And they do that, and they arrive there kind of early evening, and the German tank commander's, you know, a bit nervous about what's going on because they see gliders coming over for the air landing brigade. But what happens particularly is the British armour that side and the Canadian Army that side stops this advance. 22nd Dragoons are honoured here on this monument for halting, with some aplomb, I might say, this advance of the Germans, but it causes 22nd Dragoons to take their eye off the goal of Caen. And the 13th, 18th Hussars and the Canadian anti-tank units all then start focusing on this immediate reaction to what's happening with a German counterattack coming towards them. That, yes, we can now say it wasn't much of a counterattack. They didn't have other elements coming up behind it to exploit it. They didn't know that, though. And this is what leads us to everybody deciding, you know what, we now need to think about maintaining what we've kept and abandoning the idea of getting to Caen.
And this does, to my eye, look like pretty good tank country, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. We often think of Normandy in terms of the blockades. We think about it in terms of the restricted nature of the towns and villages with their roads butting up with little stone bridges and things. But actually, there are these areas of open wheat fields as you get towards Caen. And that's what the Germans had. The Germans don't want to get caught in little villages where one panzer gets stuck behind another panzer. They want to be able to move their tanks with speed, because 13,500 approximately Allied aircraft roving looking for targets. You don't want to get stuck at a junction. You want to move fast. Now, as I said, they didn't move as fast as they wanted to, but they are using these very fields, and you don't have to be a genius to stand here and realise this is tank country. That gap there is tank country. Yeah. Nothing to get in your way, no meaningful hedgerows, no stone walls. Get down there and hit those two beachheads when they are at their most vulnerable.
Okay, we don't do alternate history, of course, but we can conclude one thing here, and that is that possibly, if this would have happened earlier in the day, if the 21st wouldn't have been delayed, if the Hitlerjugend weren't held back and everything that was going on because Hitler wouldn't allow them to use them, this could have made a difference, right?
Yeah, you'd have to get a lot of things in alignment there, but if they get this at beachhead at the right time, perhaps they get the communications, the signals units, the fuel bowsers, things like that. Maybe they take out a brigade commander or someone like that that's in control of things. They could just make enough difference to just start things falling apart, because there are these other places on D-Day. Omaha, we know things were a little bit dicey in the morning there. The paratroopers haven't always met their objectives immediately. So there's this sort of potential domino effect that if this does work better for the Germans, maybe if the British are pushed back from Sword a little bit, or they have to focus on more of a counterattack here, they can't resupply the British 6th Airborne Division over there, so perhaps their position becomes a little bit more vulnerable. So you do have a situation where a little bit there, can start making a difference. And we also have to consider that coming in not that far behind, a 12th SS, Hitlerjugend Division, they're on their way. They had been going kind of the wrong direction. They'd heard about some Canadian paratroopers landing near Le Havre, one of their recce units was going off that way, the wrong way. Then someone back here said, no, it's all over here. And they turned their way to come back here. And their first elements start arriving very late on June the 6th. But if they'd arrived a few hours early, if 21st Panzer had arrived a few hours early, you just start nudging things to a point where it's not going to make D-Day fail, but it's going to put pressure on places, and that pressure is just going to maybe make things, casualties are going to increase.
Well, not only that, I mean, and that's why I'm bringing it up. I'm not bringing it up because we can speculate about that as much as we want, but there were people speculating about this. Schaeff were speculating about this, and they were very worried about specifically these things, but these are not unknown to the commanders, the Allied commanders. And this is specifically what they're worried about when they say, what if we get pushed back into the sea? Because they're looking at the map, they're looking at the units that they know are here, and they know that if they act promptly, if they act using these very topographical gaps, well, then the Allies are back in the water. That's basically what they know. So, foregone conclusion in all honor, and a lot of people speak of a foregone conclusion. It was never a foregone conclusion in that respect. Yes, there was a great advantage. The chances of it failing were lower. But this, right here, this gap, is where it illustrates the risk that the Allies were taking. And I mean, there are a lot of unknowns. And I think, we've looked now at various things. We've looked at the bisecting of Normandy, at Pegasus Bridge, and now that forces a binary solution. We've looked at the difficulties of Omaha because of the crescent moon shape, as you say.
Yeah, yeah.
I like yours better. It's
We
more
shall, we
poetic.
shall.
Yeah, we shall. We've looked at all of those things. And some of them were known and some of them were unknown and some of them were understood and some of them were not understood. But there was one thing that gave both sides an advantage and a disadvantage.
Yep.
But more than anything, it slowed things down tremendously, much more than expected. What was that?
That is Bocage.
So if there was one thing that they underestimated on D-Day, it was how long it would take to get to the next stages. And we're standing right now in a sort of vaulted corridor of sorts. And that had a lot to do with those delays. Can you explain?
Well, yeah, this is the Bocage. This is your classic combination of sunken lanes, earthen banks, small fields in kind of undulating environment that it has to be said the Allies were aware about it at a higher level. It's just that the fact that information hadn't filtered its way down to everybody who needed it because of the security of keeping the location of the landing secret. So if you're a GI and the 30th Division is going to be coming ashore in mid-June, you've not attended a briefing in April saying, we're going to go to this place with this, and this. So the Allies were aware about it, but yeah, it's often been described as a defender's paradise, but I can see that. I can see the fact that the Germans, who know where the gateways are, they know where the bends are, the roads, the choke points, they can fall from one to another. But the Germans hated it as much as the Allies hated it, which I think is something that's definitely worth reminding ourselves of. But it did slow everything down in this sector, just as the wheat fields and open fields in the British and Canadian sector are slowing things down there. It's not just one type of terrain in Normandy, but yeah, the Bocage was a big one.
During the night on the 6th, the morning of the 6th, basically, we have the 82nd and the 101st fighting their way through this. This must have been hell.
Well, this is it, and I'm kind of contradicting what we said earlier about the paratroopers in the fact they're not landing very far away from their drop zones, and they aren't landing very far away from their drop zones, but you're taking a stick of men who it was quite possible for one man to land in one field, the next man a stick to land in another field, and so on and so forth, down to the 19 men. So you're landing with in pitch blackness.
And what's beyond here? Who knows?
And what's beyond? That's the thing. What is beyond that hedgerow? Is there a 88mm gun dug in or a Tiger tank, or is there nothing but cows for the next 5 miles? And you've at some point got to kind of either break cover or look around a corner or walk for a gateway or use your passwords of flash, thunder and welcome, which is universally used across D-Day, those changing each day as June the 6th moved on to D+1, D+2. Or in the case of the 101st, you use your cricket for identification. I'm specifying the 101st.
Really? Okay, so only the 101st. Because in like the longest day, that's not the case.
Well, we're doing a little bit of myth busting, myth examination here. We have the orders given to the Acme Whistle Company in Birmingham, England, for these devices, these child's toy that make a click-click noise. There was not enough ordered to give to the two divisions. The 101st had them, and the 82nd, commanded by Matthew Ridgway, is quoted as saying, I'm not going to have my men jumping in with a child's toy. So they relied on the passwords only. But what's happened is, it was an absolute, you said it yourself, central part of the longest day film, with not just the film, it's John Wayne himself.
Yeah, see, that's the
Mr.
thing.
USA, we're going to use the cricket, and one click is responded by 2 clicks. So that became embedded in the false memories of 82nd Airborne veterans after wars. Once they'd seen the movie, then a member of their family then buys them a cricket at the dime store, and it goes into their collection of war goodies, although it added to it 20 years later. So the 101st had them, the 82nd didn't have them. That's not to say that there wasn't the odd trade somewhere or on the day someone lent one. So you can get the occasional story of an 82nd Airborne guy using it, but no, not as a rule, no.
But what about the scene in the movie again, The Longest Day, great movie. The scene in the movie where the guy clicks and he hears double click, and it turns out to be the rifle. And he shoots him and he goes, I heard 2 clicks. And then he dies.
Great scene and well acted there.
Thank you.
It has no basis in reality whatsoever. We don't even know really the source for it. The K9s, yeah, you can do whatever you want with that. You cannot make it sound like a cricket. In fact, when you watch the movie, they've dubbed on the sound of a cricket to the bolt sound. It's not the actual bolt of the rifle you're hearing. So I don't know where that one came from. I don't know who started it. But it endures, and it is absolute nonsense. There's no similarity to the sound of the two objects.
Okay.
So sorry about that, folks.
Can I ask a question about this? You would also find like stone walls and stuff behind these as well. It's not just vegetation and stuff, is it?
Stone walls, sometimes a strip of wire fencing, and particularly the ditches and gullies, because this particular one we're at is a single line of trees on the right and a single on the left. There can be up to 3 lines of trees.
Oh, wow.
The type with 2 is often called a doublier, which is a French word, and that would have a trough of water or ditch, and it would drop down maybe 4 or 5 feet below the road surface. So from where we are, you have maybe a 3 or 4 foot earth bank, and the other side of that, it goes down another 3 foot below the road. So you've got 8 foot of height difference there. And these are the problems. And when you start bringing the armour in here later on, and we're right in the area here where 70th Tank Battalion are fighting with Sherman tanks, the Germans had got into that sneaky habit of taking out the lead tank with the Panzerfaust, taking out the rear tank with the Panzerfaust, and trapping the other 2 of the unit in the middle there. And this is where the inability for the Sherman to get through that, they had to go over them.
Right.
And if you can imagine, even at this, which is a small hedgerow here, as that Sherman tank goes up over that bank, the coaxial machine gun and the main weapon are pointing up in the sky.
Sure.
And you're exposing your belly to the enemy before the tank crashes down the other side. And that is where your expert member of particularly the 6th Fallschirmjäger, 3rd Fallschirmjäger, who have this real small unit concept, 2 guys going out on their own with a Panzerfaust and a machine gun, in the underside of the tank, from underneath, you've knocked out a tank.
Wow.
And then as soon as the Germans got into a position where they feel like they're being overrun at one hedgerow, they just fall back to the next one and begin the setup again, with the Allies not knowing what's going on. And the point I always make is that as bad as it could get on Omaha Beach in the first wave, and it was pretty bad there in that first wave, you can see the threat that is there, because there is a bunker there somewhere to your left with flames coming out of it and shells coming out. That's your objective. Knock that out, we can move on. Most men killed in the hedgerows were killed by a weapon they never saw. They're killed by indirect fire from mortars 500 yards that way, and they're killed by a machine gun that has been perfectly located in a corner, does its job, burst, kills a few guys. You then know where it is as an Allied soldier, but by the time you go up to attack it, it's moved back to the next hedgerow. So it's just an endless repetition of the same horror, frankly.
And you said horror, which is, what literally happened here during the night or the morning of the 6th, which also gave rise to a lot of rumors, because there are other aspects of this that we haven't spoken about yet, but above us is a tree. And we got guys coming in attached to a big canopy, a lot of strings on them, and they get stuck in these trees. And then you have the Germans coming in, literally taking them out as they're there. And that gave rise to rumors of atrocities being committed, which inflated the fighting will of the men. And on both sides, they got into hand-to-hand combat, killing each other with knives and stuff in these hedgerows. And part of it, not just because they were being tactical, because they were just furious at somebody going after them. But in post-World War II historiography, we've largely ignored this part of the story. They had an order: do not take any prisoners. They were angry. And what went on here was, on both sides, I'm not casting any stone in any direction, but this was largely war crimes in many parts of what went on here.
Well, yeah, it's the use of language gets debatable now as the victors writing the history and what have you. But yeah, no, these things happen. And the problem with units taking a while to assemble together as a company, there's no one there with authority to quash rumours and sort things out and say, look, take a deep breath, everybody, let's just calm down. You may not be meeting your platoon commander for the first 3 or 4 days, so you're with another guy from another unit you don't know, and rumours are running rife, and there are cases, there aren't many of them, but there are cases of men landing directly in the middle of German positions, about 3 miles that way at Holdy. A stick of 506 land in the middle of the rear of a German gun battery, and one of the poor guys, his feet are 6 foot off the ground. They take his phosphorus grenade off him. ignite it, put it back between his legs, and watch him burn to death as the phosphorus burns up through him, whilst they're stabbing at him with bayonets for good measure. And then, can you imagine, there you're another paratrooper who then walks past this 2 hours later.
Yeah, you see the guy.
And you see that guy there. Now, as I said, it's not being repeated across the battlefield in great numbers, but lots of people went past those individual guys, and those that didn't heard someone else say how they'd been it, and then 2 becomes 4 becomes 6, and then you get the stories of the reprisals taken out against German prisoners. And those first few hours were very, very difficult for these paratroopers, and yet we must keep on to the idea that within all this, they are getting their objectives, they are seizing the positions they have to do, and the Germans are, on the whole, more confused by this situation than the Allies are over those first vital hours of the hours before D-Day, which brings us this idea of this being connected to the landings on Utah Beach. This is chapter 1, the landings on the beach is chapter 2, and then pushing on together is chapter 3.
In conclusion of everything that we've seen so far, which side do you think benefited most from the geography and topography of the day?
Of the first day, probably the Germans. And then even for the next few weeks, the Germans, because you have to wait for the Allies to adopt the techniques they did to deal with this stuff. And the Germans, not that we're labeling them as never changing their tactics, they did really stick to the same methods they'd used on the first 2 days of falling back. And by then, we've got the Rhino hedgerow cutter for Cobra. We've got the devices of setting up our mortars in the corners of fields and automatically hitting those corners before we know there are enemy there, because the likelihood is that is where the enemy, because that's what we've experienced for the last 6 weeks. So the Allied learning curve starts off quite shallow, but it kind of skyrockets up certainly by the beginning of July. And the Germans just keep on doing the same thing. And this then connects, of course, with Adolf Hitler's "Don't retreat an inch" order. And over the course of the German divisions, to me, the one that really gives us a clue as to what the Germans could have done better using terrain is Panzer Lehr, and Fritz Bayerlin, who probably get as a single armoured unit account for more Allied casualties on their front because of their brilliant use of terrain and falling back. And they are fighting in an area of a combination of hedgerows and open fields and choke points and hills. And yet they kind of get ignored by historians because everyone talks about the 12th SS, 3 books last year alone on the 12th SS. Panzer Lehr.
I'll get to them eventually.
You'll get to them eventually. But yeah, so it does switch. The Germans have the upper hand early, and then the Allies start getting to grips with this stuff. But, I'm standing here. I've stood in hedgerows just like this one with veterans who were here, who have automatically edged their ways into the side and kind of got out of the way there because of this fear of what they experienced there. And I want to remind people, not just a week. This is some of these units, like the 1st Division, Omaha, 4th Division. This is 2 months of this daily grind where you're measuring your progression in yards. Even at the end of the closing of the Falaise Gap in August, we're less than 60 miles from the sea. So we're talking about an average of about half a mile a day. 29th Division, Omaha Beach, recorded how many obstacles there were between the beach and their objective of San Lo, part of 5th Corps. It was 33 obstacles every mile of progression, meaning 33 trenches, stone walls, farmhouses, hedgerows, every mile. So when people look at a map and go, well, from there to there doesn't seem very long, why are they taking 6 weeks? Go there and see this stuff, because the next hedgerow that way is 50 yards that way, and so on and so forth. This is a delay. The Allies are grinding the Germans down. The attritional war is going in the Allies' favour. The Germans cannot replace their vehicles that are knocked out. They haven't got enough people to replace their losses. The Allies, it has to be said, if they do lose 2 Shermans in this hedgerow, they can replace it with 4 more coming off the boat that afternoon. So the attritional aspect is going our way. But for the guys who were here, it was a grind that I'm not comparing. Comparisons to Stalingrad, comparisons to Merrill's Marauders, they don't work. But this is a place where these guys just had day after day of relentless misery.
History has a habit of repeating itself.
All the way back in 1415, the advisors to King Charles VI of France wondered where King Henry V would disembark his English army. He had basically two options: choose Normandy and march through the countryside, or choose Calais, where his enemies mostly expected him to land. Here in 1944, however, just by looking at the map, the Allied Expeditionary Force seemed to have total freedom of choice, with landing options ranging from Norway to Spain, and they certainly want the Germans to believe this, but in reality, their choices are really limited.
I was wondering where you were going with that. First off, the invasion zone has to be adequately protected and supported by the air forces, so everything beyond, say, 500 kilometers from the most southern airfields in Britain is out. Then the invasion site needs to be suitable for the naval operations of Operation Neptune, meaning it can't just be a landing zone for some infantry landing craft, but one large enough to ensure the invaders' supply chain with a constant stream of tanks, vehicles, and heavy equipment, and no bottlenecks. Third, because of that, it also needs the infrastructure to move all of these things. So they need a major road network nearby, and preferably a major port too. So what the Allies have been basically left with are those same two old options. Either the area at the Pas de Calais, between the estuary of the Somme and Dunkirk, or Normandy's coastline between Caen and the Cotentin Peninsula. While many of the Allied army and air chiefs on the combined planners actually favored an assault against the Pas de Calais because of its geographic location as an entry towards the Ruhr, the Navy vetoed that. Louis Mountbatten, chief of combined operations, had to remind everyone that attacking a well-fortified harbor head-on with a bunch of elite German divisions and Luftwaffe bases close by is a very bad idea. The Navy favored Normandy and the Calvados coast, and the military geography isn't that bad either. The port at Caen, although rather small, could be taken quickly if they played their cards right. Capturing Caen also has the benefit of the main railroad towards Paris, basically isolating the rest of the Cotentin Peninsula. The airfield of Carpiquet is also close by, so it doesn't look at all bad on paper, but there are other wildcards to a landing in Normandy, those not to be answered by generals looking over a map, but by geographic experts, geologists, and meteorologists. The first necessary step is beach reconnaissance. By 1944, the Allies have assembled an enormous amount of intelligence from all kinds of sources and agencies. Military aerial reconnaissance has provided huge panoramic photos that are hung up in conference rooms. The French resistance has smuggled maps, charts, data sheets out of the German offices. French citizens answered an initiative by the BBC and gathered millions of vacation photos and postcards portraying the beaches of Normandy. So photo intelligence is pretty much as good as it can get in the era before satellites, whatever they are. From Utah to Omaha, from Gold to Juno to Sword, each beach has been thoroughly mapped out. For example, Utah Beach, at the southeastern corner of the Cotentin's coastal sector, is determined to be 9,655 yards long. That's 8,829 meters. Its low-lying terrain is without distinctive features and mostly composed of compact gray sand between the high and low watermarks. The danger for the attackers lay with a masonry seawall, which stretches almost the entire length of the beach. Behind the wall, there are also sand dunes, approximately 3 to 8 meters high, which extend further inland for nearly 140 meters before descending into the lowlands. This information is important for the planners, as they can directly prepare their assault groups to tackle such an environment during training runs. Everyone is well aware that the Germans are very good at manipulating and using topography for defensive purposes. Like, immediately behind the beach is a flat plain, more than 1.5 kilometers wide, which the Germans have flooded and basically turned into a giant lake. The only way for vehicles to break out of Utah Beach is to use 4 narrow, partially flooded causeways. And those exits are most certainly blocked. I mean, we saw all this, but, drama. Another example is Omaha Beach, which has always been a cause for concern among the planners. Although the sandy beach rises smoothly towards the shingle with only a small seawall situated before a patch of marshy grassland, beyond that are rows of steep bluffs 30 to 50 meters high that overlook the bay. Often covered in seaweed, these bluffs have a commanding view and present an obvious challenge to invading troops on the beaches. To take these heights, the Allied soldiers would need to overrun the steeply rising valleys in between them, which are also the only possible route for vehicles to drive off the beach. Naturally, these narrow openings are expected to be covered by German guns. And it isn't just the topography of the beaches, it's also the approach that might cause the problems. In the case of Juno Beach, there are those underwater reefs and razor-sharp rocks that can tear a landing craft apart. And Normandy in general is known for its dangerous tides and the intensity with which they surge back and forth. Even the best navigators can't predict all the things that lie beneath the surface. Same goes for all the small hiding spaces and ambush sites in between the cliffs, from which the enemy has a clear field of fire. But there is a way to find those things out, you know. To get a first-hand account about such things as ground-bearing capacity or the actual state of enemy alertness at the coast, there is a way. It's just extremely dangerous. Enter COPS, C-O-P-P-S, the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, a top-secret program established by SHAEF to give the Allied planners a first-hand account of the beach's geology and topography. COPS are basically teams of naval and army officers, specially selected to exercise covert recon missions on the enemy shoreline. They are to answer the questions all the gathered photographs cannot, namely, is the geological composition of the beach itself actually suitable for the invasion? Would the ground west of the Orne River be solid enough to support the heavy weight of tanks, armored vehicles, and fully loaded trucks? Because if they land their tanks on ground made out of soft clay, wet marshes, or quicksand, then it will be a very short invasion. To provide answers to these questions, COPS agents are to obtain geological samples that can then be analyzed. Most COPS missions are undertaken in the winter of 1943 and the early spring of 1944, since the long dark nights provide good cover. The recon agents are sent in on midget submarines, tiny X-craft, or LCPs towed into position by trawlers. In the case of the latter, they stealthily approach the shore until a depth of 10 meters, then swim to shore and let the waves silently carry them to the beach. The men wear watertight wetsuits reinforced at the elbows and knees because they are expected to do a lot of crawling. In their various pockets and pouches, they carry a lot of specialized equipment, like a waterproof compass, an auger for taking core samples from the ground, as well as a bandolier of bags for samples from the shingle, or a simple fishing line to measure the distance from the shore. Throughout the cold, dark night, the men work their way along the beach to find out as much as possible. COPS has even prepared a whole sheet of questions for them, like, what is the bearing capacity and the hardness of the surface? Do runnels exist that would cause vehicles to bog down? Is there shingle, which could become a natural anti-tank obstacle? And then there are questions about the enemy's activity. Are the Germans busy reinforcing the defenses or laying mines? How are their positions laid out at the coast? Is there a commanding slope or ridge? If yes, would those ridges be negotiable by vehicles? How vigilant is the enemy? Are there torches or searchlights at night? Of course, not everything can be answered. The agents of COPS are not expected to sneak their way into the German defenses and take pictures. No, they mostly lie there in the dark, shallow waters, listening and watching what's going on. And this helps a lot because it is a first-hand experience. Of course, it goes without saying that these missions are extremely dangerous. The smallest mishap might land them in the hands of the Gestapo, who would shoot them as commandos or saboteurs without even a trial. Even worse, being captured means that their specialized equipment would surely betray the nature of their visit. This could jeopardize the whole operation if the Germans put zwei und zwei together, right? Ironically, only one party does get captured during the night of May 17th and 18th. And it just happens to be the one party operating at the Pas de Calais, which only further cements the German belief that it is there the Allies will attack. Overall, COPS is a success, and the intelligence is worth the risk. All those samples of sand, gravel, dirt, and the data on the force of currents and tides can now be analyzed and put into the planning phase. The Allies now know to avoid areas with patches of soft clay or wet marshes. If they cannot, then they must find countermeasures, like outfitting the tanks with rolls of steel matting, the bobbins and the roly-polies we saw this morning. Or in places where the cops find a lot of mines, the Allies send in bombers to churn up the place, or bring in flail tanks to mash their way right through. Of course, there are still several places where the Allied vehicles find themselves in trouble, as we've seen, but overall, it has done what it was supposed to do, and COPS actually remains in action until today, making a preliminary landing of their own in small landing crafts. They activate small guiding beacons on the beaches to provide navigational assistance for the main force. But geology is only one natural factor that would impact the landings. Another is the weather. Okay, every commander worth his salt is preoccupied with the weather, the one thing totally beyond human control. The Allied authority on the matter, and chief meteorological advisor to the Supreme Commander, is Professor J.M. Stagg. He and his team have obtained, recorded, and analyzed all the necessary meteorological information for Normandy and the English Channel that is available. They base their forecasts on weather maps going back at least 50 years in order to try to make out some sort of pattern for their predictions. But this sounds easier than it is. Stagg points out that even when the weather charts for 1 or 2 days look identical to the sequence of the previous year, the charts that immediately follow are almost always not. So dissimilar and varying is the data that prognostics are nearly impossible, yet Schaeff puts a lot of trust in their judgment. Because they have to. After all, Hitler himself hopes that a storm will cut them off at the time of their invasion. So the importance of meteorology should not be understated. Even Eisenhower himself has a great personal interest in the science of weather forecasts and is always eager to hear an honest opinion from his meteorological advisor. By the end of May, as the possible invasion dates draw near, Stagg and his fellow scientists have to come up with a prediction. The complexity of moving the giant armada requires a minimum forecast of 72 hours ahead of D-Day, as well as 2 days following the landings. So Stagg makes his first, but crucial forecast. At this time of the year, continuous spells of more than a few days of really stormy weather are infrequent. If the disturbed weather starts on Friday, it is unlikely to last through both Monday, June 5th, and Tuesday. But if it is delayed to Saturday and Sunday, the weather on Monday and Tuesday could well be stormy. And truly, as June begins, the prospects of favorable weather for D-Day dim. On Friday, June 2nd, Stagg tells Eisenhower the unwelcome news that the whole weather situation from the British Isles over to Newfoundland is looking anything but fair. The next day, the Supreme Commander should make a decision, proceed or postpone the invasion, possibly to the end of the month. Some of the ships are already underway to their rendezvous points south of the Isle of Wight. The Navy needs to know if they should recall them or not. At 9:30 p.m. on the 3rd, Eisenhower calls his commanders into the conference room. Once more, they ask Stagg his opinion on the matter, but the meteorologist can only reiterate his previous concerns. Bomber and Airborne Command have a lot of follow-up questions about cloud density and visibility, but in the end, Eisenhower asks the deciding question: do all the forecasting centers agree on the forecast? Stagg says yes. Eisenhower decides to postpone the operation for 1 more day. The final decision will take place on the 4th. But even such a short postponement is full of dangers in and of itself. Not every ship captain can easily be informed of the revised H hour, and some convoys have already sailed. For example, Group U-2A, a convoy of 138 headed for Utah Beach, do not receive the postponement signal, and they're only recalled at the last minute. Another pair of destroyers is caught in a previously undiscovered minefield, which also sinks a sweeper. There are casualties before the invasion even begins. Another team that is entirely unhappy about the postponement are the agents of COPS. By now, they have approached the coast in their midget submarines, X-20 and X-23, in order to place and activate the guidance beacons to mark the assault areas. Now they're stuck in their cramped iron shoeboxes for at least another 24 hours, staying submerged and only rising to periscope depth every 5 hours to draw fresh air into the boat. They can do nothing but wait and hope that they aren't discovered. As the sun rises on Sunday, June 4th, everyone can see that Stagg and his colleagues are correct, and a large depression clouds the skies. It seems like the invasion date must be postponed for good now. As Stagg says, no one could have imagined weather charts less propitious for the greatest military operations in history as those we had before us. But suddenly, when the evening draws to a close and the Supreme Commander ponders his final decision on the matter, some rapid and unexpected development occurs over the North Atlantic. Once more, unpredictable meteorological change takes place. And now it suddenly looks like the weather will actually improve. Stagg revises his prediction. Behind that fair interlude, clouds will probably increase again later on Tuesday. From early Wednesday until at least Friday, the weather will continue unsettled. This means that the weather on Tuesday, June 6th, will actually meet the requirements laid down by sea and air commanders. This sudden change puts the Supreme Commander on the spot. He has to decide if it's better to postpone the operation by weeks, in case that this is a temporary and partial break in bad weather, or to grab the opportunity by the throat and get going. He listens to everyone's opinions on the matter, and then at the end, Eisenhower turns to Bernard Montgomery, who says in a very calm manner, "I would say go." And that is it. The invasion will take place on June 6th. Now, with the die finally cast, all the tension in the room evaporates. Well, for everyone but Stagg. In fact, it is yet another sleepless night for him and his forecasters. Throughout the night, they hold their telephone conference, comparing data, discussing divergent views. At 4:45 a.m., the conference ends with the final forecast. Stagg reports good news. All morning long, until late afternoon, there will be fair weather, good visibility, and winds not exceeding 4 or maybe 5 on the Beaufort scale, all along the invasion beaches. And once more, they are right. As the first transport planes carrying the paratroopers cross the channel on D-Day, the clouds begin to break. The wind is dropping, and weather conditions all along the coast have improved. Ironically, the German meteorologists, given the more limited Atlantic information available to them, come to the opposite decision, proclaiming that the weather would continue to be unsuitable for the invasion. Rommel puts his trust in these predictions and has left the front, as we saw. Once again, science helps pave the way for victory. Although it might not be the place for medals, accolades, or heroic stories, the many analysts and scientists here have been an invaluable asset to the invasion force.
So many factors like that to consider to launch an operation of this magnitude and even have a prayer of a chance.
Yep, things like local communications. For commanders of the 82nd and 101st, the lack of communications throughout D-Day has been especially strenuous on the nerves. And not just a lack of contact with the seaborne invasion, but with a large chunk of their own units as well. The force was under-equipped with portable radios, which has led to a lot of uncertainty and guesswork. For Maxwell Taylor of the 101st, it was not until he personally saw the spearheads of the 4th Division moving down the roads that he could safely conclude that at least some things must have gone according to plan. Nonetheless, he is quite concerned about the absence of reports from the South. The fate of Johnson's 501st PIR, as well as that of at least one battalion of the 506, is still unknown to him. Rumors of a terrible drop in the southernmost landing zones and a much stronger response by the enemy are reasons for worry. For now, Taylor assumes the worst-case scenario, that the units in the south have been destroyed and that the objectives in the area have not been accomplished. Which, indeed, is at least partly true. Saint-Côme-du-Mont and its roadway towards Carentan are still in German hands as the day heads towards its close. Here, the airborne has not achieved victory. And if the Germans are aware of that, as their heavy resistance in the area indicates, then this is a major gap in the American lines through which the enemy could direct armored forces right into the Allied flanks. Something must be done soon to prevent that. But while the 101st has at least made contact with the 4th Division, the 82nd, for the most part, has no idea how the whole operation is going. The daring plan to land Task Force RAF at Utah and have them roll straight into the 82nd's enclave at Sainte-Mère-Église, well, that was stopped dead in its tracks. The strong German presence on the ridges at Le Forge needs to be dealt with, hopefully sooner rather than later. This leaves the 82nd in a rather vulnerable state. Hopes are pinned high on being supplied by gliders in the evening hours now that the seaborne invasion is supposed to be moving inland, but until then, Matt Ridgway tries to keep his playing pieces together. They are still surrounded, after all. We couldn't get in touch with anybody, neither the troops that were supposed to be coming in over the beaches by now, or with anybody back in England, nor with anybody afloat. In short, we were in the typical situation for which you must be prepared when an airborne division goes into battle. The men of 48 Royal Marine Commando are still stuck at Langrune. They've been there all day. The Germans inside WN-26 have just sat inside and let shells bounce off what seems to be impregnable concrete. The Marines have taken 50% casualties today and have not achieved much at all. Their advance team did go to the rendezvous point with 41 Commando coming from Sword, but the men of 41 are nowhere to be found. The 6th Field Company Royal Canadian Engineers, they've been unsung heroes at Juno Beach today. It is they that have spent the day clearing the beach obstructions, and they, who began the day with 100 men, they will number 26 when the sun goes down. Regina Rifles Battalion headquarters moved south from Rivière around 5 p.m. And by now, the Rifles have taken Fontaine-Henri and then advanced to Le Frein-Camélie, and this is where they will dig in for the night. The Canadian Scottish, with elements of the 1st Hussars nearby, dig in at Pierrepont. So the 7th Brigade is in a line from Saint-Gabriel east. As for the 8th, the Queen's own rifles will dig in at Anagni and Annecy. The North Shores are still at Tailleville, and the Chaudes at Thon. Sure, Keller's left flank is sort of constrained by digging in at Tailleville and just bypassing the radar station at Douvres, and he's frustrated that things like the bottleneck at Bernières really held his guys up from actually taking their objectives. But his men are in good position as night falls, well dug in and prepared for any counterattack that might come on the morrow. By the end of this day, WNs 1 through 10 have all fallen. 4th Division has gotten off Utah Beach in force, and this is where they are. 1 battalion of the 22nd Infantry holds Les Côtes in the north. The rest holds Saint-Germain-de-Vareville. Reeder's 12th Infantry has Beuzeville-au-Plan. Van Fleet's 8th Infantry Poupeville, and Barton has the divisional headquarters at Andouille-la-Hubert. Those 5 little villages are the 4th Division perimeter at the end of D-Day, which is a pretty darn impressive penetration, and this is what is now prepared to oppose them. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment is to their south, and the 1057th Grenadier Regiment from the 91st Luftlandedivision Division to the west. But those guys have the 82nd and 101st Airborne scattered all throughout them. The Luftlande's Divisional Reserve, the 795th Georgian Battalion, is at Turqueville, also among the Airborne. The 1058th Grenadiers from 91st Luftlande and some units of 243rd Division are in the north to try to block any move towards Cherbourg.
So we see that things are wrapping up for the day, at Utah and Juno at least.
Well, things semi-slow down as we inch towards sunset, less than 2 hours from now, though there will be scattered action all night. This hour, though, Marshall is the first reporter to return to the studio and give his eyewitness account of the battle.
On the German side, 2 significant things happen. 1, it is concluded that Rommel will not arrive in time to make any difference today. 2, Obi West issue their evening report and pretty much cede the day to the Allies. A couple of hours ago, Jodl called and ordered Rundstedt to counterattack immediately and throw the Allies back into the sea before nightfall. Rundstedt politely declined the offer.
I would have loved to have a recording of that call, you know? Yeah.
Indeed. In any case, the Oberwest Evening Situation Reports outlines the events of the day, adds that fighting will resume in earnest tomorrow, from what they expect to be an even stronger enemy by then, and that units are being deployed to meet that threat. It concludes dryly that deployment is being carried out as planned, final success report still pending.
I think it is safe to say that although today is slowly concluding, the Allies can look forward to some serious German opposition in the days to come.
And what can we look forward to in the next hour?
The next hour is going to have a couple of deep dives into 2 raids, one this morning and one a couple of years ago.
Deep, huh?
Yes, deep, or should I say, Dieppe, when we return in hour 21 of D-Day.